Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever felt the weight of silence pressing down on you like a living thing? When every creak of old wood sounds like a warning, and every shadow seems to hold secrets you were never meant to discover. Marcus Rivera had worked as a night security guard at the Elmwood Public Library for 3 months, but he had never truly understood what it meant to be alone with thousands of sleeping stories. Until that particular October evening, until the darkness between the shelves began to breathe, and the whispers started seeping from pages that should have remained forever closed. It began with the sound of turning pages. At first, it was barely audible, like the gentle rustling of paper in a distant reading room. Something so subtle you might dismiss it as the building settling, or perhaps the autumn wind finding its way through the old window frames. But Marcus couldn't ignore it. The sound seemed to vibrate through the hardwood floors, echoing up through the towering shelves that surrounded him like ancient sentinels. He sat at his desk in the main circulation area, surrounded by the familiar maze of book stacks that had become his nightly domain. The Elmwood Library was a grand old building, constructed in 1892 with soaring Gothic arches and stained glass windows that cast colorful shadows during the day. But at night, those same architectural features transformed into something far more ominous. The vaulted ceilings stretched up into darkness, and the narrow aisles between the shelves seemed to extend infinitely into shadow. The books themselves had begun to feel different. Their spines, once merely colorful indicators of knowledge and stories, now seemed to watch him. The leather bindings appeared to shift and breathe in his peripheral vision, as if the volumes were quietly communicating with one another in a language he couldn't understand. The smell of old paper and binding glue, usually comforting, had taken on an almost organic quality, like the scent of something ancient and alive. Marcus turned his attention to the tall windows that lined the eastern wall. Outside, the streetlights created pools of amber light on the empty sidewalk, but between those circles of illumination, the darkness seemed unusually thick. The usual sounds of the city at night, the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional voices of late-night pedestrians were completely absent. It was as if the entire world had been muffled, leaving only the library and its contents suspended in an unnatural quiet. His breathing grew shallow, and a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the building's old heating system. Something was watching him from the spaces between the books. The sensation started small, just a nagging feeling that he wasn't alone among the stacks. At first, Marcus convinced himself it was natural paranoia, the kind that comes with working alone in a large, empty building. But as the minutes passed, the feeling intensified. The shadows between the shelves seemed to move independently of his flashlight beam, sliding from one section to another with purpose and intelligence. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed through the cavernous space. The noise seemed to awaken something in the building, and Marcus could swear he heard a soft sigh, as if the library itself had been holding its breath. The fiction section, which stretched along the building's south wall, had always been his favorite area to patrol. The familiar names of authors and the colorful array of book spines usually provided a sense of comfort and order. But now, as he approached the towering shelves, something felt fundamentally wrong. The books seemed to lean inward, creating narrow corridors that disappeared into impenetrable darkness. His flashlight beam, usually strong enough to illuminate the entire aisle, seemed to be absorbed by the shadows, creating only a small circle of visibility around his feet. Marcus moved slowly through the stacks, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. He could feel his heartbeat accelerating, the rhythm becoming increasingly erratic as he ventured deeper into the maze of shelves. And then he heard it clearly, the sound of pages turning, but not the gentle whisper of someone reading. This was different, urgent, multiple books opening and closing simultaneously, as if invisible hands were frantically searching through volumes, seeking something specific. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the stacks in a disorienting symphony of rustling paper. Marcus stopped, his hand tightening around his flashlight. The beam trembled slightly as his grip became unsteady. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" The page-turning stopped immediately, as if his words had broken some kind of spell. The silence that followed was so complete it felt oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm when even the birds stopped singing. Marcus strained to hear any sound, any indication of movement, but the library had returned to its unnatural quiet. He turned to head back toward his desk, but the familiar path seemed to have changed. The aisles that should have led directly to the circulation area now branched off in directions that hadn't existed before. The logical, orderly layout of the library had somehow become a labyrinth, with passages that curved and twisted in ways that defied the building's actual architecture. Marcus chose what he thought was the correct direction, but after several minutes of walking, he found himself in a section of the library he didn't recognize. The books here were older, bound in dark leather with titles written in faded gold lettering. Many of the volumes had no titles at all, just smooth, black spines that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air in this section was different too, thick with the scent of aged parchment and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The shelves here reached higher than in other parts of the library, stretching up into darkness that his flashlight couldn't penetrate. Between the books, Marcus noticed gaps, spaces where volumes should have been, but weren't. These empty slots seemed to pulse with their own darkness, as if they were windows into some other realm. He reached out tentatively to touch one of the leather-bound volumes, but the moment his fingers made contact with the spine, the book fell open in his hands. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in text written in a script he didn't recognize. But as he stared at the incomprehensible symbols, they began to shift and rearrange themselves, forming words in English that made his blood run cold. "You should not be here," the page read, the letters appearing to write themselves as he watched. The knowledge contained within these walls was meant to remain hidden. But since you have found us, you must stay. You must become part of the collection. Marcus dropped the book, and it hit the floor with a sound like thunder. The impact seemed to reverberate through the entire building, and suddenly the library came alive with activity. Books began falling from shelves throughout the stacks, their pages fluttering open as they tumbled through the air like wounded birds. The sound of turning pages resumed, but now it was accompanied by what sounded like whispers, hundreds of voices speaking in languages both familiar and utterly alien. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until Marcus could almost make out individual words. They seemed to be calling his name, but not just his name. They were calling the names of everyone who had ever worked in the library, everyone who had ever spent long hours alone among the books. The voices of librarians and security guards, researchers and students, all of them speaking in unison, all of them warning him to run while he still could. But when Marcus turned to flee, he found that the path behind him had vanished. The shelves had moved, rearranging themselves into new configurations, blocking his escape route. The library had become a living thing, its shelves and corridors shifting and changing according to some malevolent intelligence. He was trapped in a maze of knowledge that had turned predatory. The whispers continued, growing more urgent, more desperate. Marcus could hear footsteps now, but not the solid sound of shoes on carpet. These were softer, like the padding of bare feet, or perhaps the sound of pages brushing against the floor as something moved through the stacks. The footsteps seemed to come from all directions at once, circling him, getting closer with each passing moment. Marcus pressed his back against the nearest shelf, the books behind him feeling warm and alive, as if they were breathing. The leather bindings seemed to pulse against his spine, and he could swear he felt them shifting, rearranging themselves to better accommodate his presence. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The library wasn't just alive, it was hungry. It fed on the people who spent their lives surrounded by books, slowly absorbing them, making them part of its eternal collection. A new sound emerged from the darkness ahead of him. It was the creak of old wood, but rhythmic, deliberate, like the sound of someone rocking in a chair, or perhaps the slow opening and closing of a door. The sound grew closer, and with it came a presence that made the air itself feel heavy and oppressive. "You cannot leave," a voice whispered, and this time it wasn't coming from the books. It was coming from directly in front of him, spoken by something that stood just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. "No one who finds this section ever leaves. You will join the others. You will become part of the collection, your knowledge and your experiences absorbed into the great library of human consciousness." Marcus raised his flashlight, but the beam seemed to bend around whatever was standing in the darkness, creating a void in the shape of a person. The absence of light was more terrifying than any monster could have been, because it suggested something that existed beyond the normal rules of reality. "What are you?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "I am the librarian," the voice replied, and there was something almost sad in its tone. "I am the keeper of forbidden knowledge, the guardian of stories that were never meant to be told. I was like you once, a simple worker in this place. But I discovered the truth about what lies hidden in these walls, and that discovery changed me. Now I serve the library, and the library serves me." The darkness began to move, flowing like liquid shadow between the shelves. Marcus could feel it reaching for him, trying to envelope him in its embrace. He stumbled backward, deeper into the maze of books. But with each step he took, the shelves seemed to grow taller, the corridors narrower, until he was running through passages barely wide enough for his shoulders. Behind him, the whispers had become a chorus of voices, all of them speaking in unison, all of them repeating the same phrase over and over: "Join us, join us, join us." The books themselves seemed to be reaching for him now, their pages fluttering like grasping hands. Titles and words began to peel away from their covers, swirling through the air like a tornado of text. The very language was trying to capture him, to drag him into the stories, and make him part of their narrative structure. Marcus burst through what felt like a curtain of hanging pages, and found himself in a circular room he had never seen before. The walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling, but these volumes were different from any he had encountered. They glowed with a soft, pulsing light, and their pages seemed to be made of something that wasn't quite paper. The air in this room was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something that reminded him of the smell of lightning strikes. In the center of the room stood a massive desk, its surface covered with open books that wrote themselves, their pages filling with new text even as he watched. Behind the desk sat a figure that might once have been human, but had been transformed by years of exposure to the library's supernatural influence. Its skin was pale as parchment, and its eyes were black as printer's ink. When it smiled, Marcus could see that its teeth were made of compressed paper. "Welcome to the true library," the figure said, its voice like the whisper of pages turning. "This is where the real collection is kept. The books that contain not just stories, but the essence of every person who has ever become lost in these halls. You will find your place here, among the volumes that hold the deepest secrets of human consciousness." Marcus backed toward the door, but found that it had vanished. The circular room was sealed, with no exit except through the entity that sat behind the desk. The books on the walls began to glow brighter, and their pages started to turn of their own accord, filling the air with a symphony of rustling paper. "You cannot escape," the figure continued, rising from its chair. "This library exists in the spaces between reality, in the gaps where lost knowledge goes to hide. Every person who has ever worked alone among books, who has ever felt the weight of accumulated wisdom pressing down on them, eventually finds their way here. You are not the first, and you will not be the last." The room began to spin, the books on the walls blurring into a whirlwind of text and image. Marcus felt his feet leave the ground as he was pulled into the vortex of knowledge that surrounded him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer voices, but had become the very language of thought itself. He could feel his memories being pulled from his mind, his experiences being transcribed onto invisible pages. The library was cataloging him, organizing his life into chapters and sections, preparing to add him to its eternal collection. His consciousness was being absorbed, word by word, thought by thought, until he was no longer Marcus Rivera, but simply another story in the vast library of human experience. The last thing he remembered was the sound of a book closing, the final page of his story being turned for the last time. And then there was only the whisper of pages, the eternal conversation between volumes that would continue long after the sun had set for the final time. In the morning, the day shift would find the security desk empty, with no sign of where the night guard had gone. The official report would list him as missing, another person who had simply vanished without explanation. But if they had known where to look, If they had ventured into the deepest sections of the library, where the oldest books were kept, they might have found a new volume on one of the highest shelves. Book bound in midnight blue leather, with a title written in silver letters that seemed to shimmer in the light. The Complete Life and Experiences of Marcus Rivera, Night Security Guard. And if someone had been brave enough to open that book and read its contents, they would have found the most accurate record of a human life ever written, told in the subject's own words, preserved forever in the library's eternal collection. But such books were not meant to be read by the living. They were part of the library's deeper purpose, the accumulation of human knowledge and experience that would continue long after humanity itself had become nothing more than a memory written in volumes that no one would ever open. The whispers between the pages continued, as they always had, as they always would. And somewhere in the darkness between the shelves, the figure behind the desk smiled and opened a new, blank book, ready to record the next story that would inevitably find its way into the collection. The library was patient. It had all the time in the world. It should never have started this way. How could something so ordinary, so forgotten, unleash such terror? I had always been drawn to mysteries. Maybe that curiosity would be my downfall. But I never imagined what I would uncover. I was clearing out the basement of my grandmother's cottage, the one she had left me when she passed last spring. Margaret had been a woman of few words, keeping to herself in this mountain village for as long as anyone could remember. The cottage held an odd stillness, as if the wooden beams themselves harbored secrets too heavy to speak. I never enjoyed spending long hours there, but after her funeral, duty called. The plan was simple: sort through her belongings and prepare the place for sale. Nothing more complicated than that. Then I discovered it. An old VHS tape tucked away in a shoebox behind dusty mason jars and forgotten photographs. The label was handwritten in faded ink, Personal 1987. It looked innocent enough, just another relic from decades past. But something about it felt wrong, as though it had been waiting in that dark corner for someone to find it. I hesitated. Logic told me it was probably just old family footage, holiday gatherings, or birthday parties. Yet an inexplicable urge pushed me to dust off grandmother's ancient television and VCR player. What harm could come from watching a bit of old home movies? I had no idea that the moment I pressed play, I was inviting something far more sinister than memories into my world. The screen flickered to life, displaying grainy footage of familiar streets. My heart skipped. These were the same roads I walked daily, the same shops I visited, the same park where I had played as a child. But something was terribly wrong with the images. They wavered and distorted, as if the camera lens was fighting against what it was recording. The footage showed the old Methodist church at the edge of town, the one that had been abandoned for 30 years. But standing in its overgrown cemetery was a figure, a man in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face remained hidden in shadow, but his posture suggested he was watching, waiting for something, or someone. The tape ended abruptly, leaving me staring at static. My pulse quickened as I sat in the dim basement light, uncertain whether I should continue or pack everything away and pretend this never happened. But curiosity, that same dangerous curiosity that had brought me here, compelled me forward. I fast-forwarded to the next segment. This time the footage was clearer. The same figure appeared again, standing in the same cemetery. But now there was something else. A shape lurking in the broken church windows behind him, moving in ways that made my skin crawl. It was a silhouette I couldn't quite identify, yet it filled me with inexplicable dread. My chest tightened. I should have stopped. I should have ejected the tape and thrown it away. But I didn't. I watched every remaining minute. Each segment revealed more footage of my village, the general store, the main crossroads, the old covered bridge. But in every scene, something was fundamentally wrong. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Faces in windows appeared and vanished. The figure in the hat seemed to be drawing closer to the people I recognized, people I cared about. Then came the final segment. The footage was filmed inside my grandmother's cottage. I could hear her voice in the background, though the words were muffled and distorted, as if the recording equipment was struggling against some unseen interference. But it wasn't her voice that terrified me. It was the shadow creeping across the living room wall, moving toward the camera with impossible fluidity. The shadow took the shape of a person, but its movements were all wrong, too jerky and unnatural. The shadow stopped directly in front of the lens, and I felt ice water flood my veins. Then the tape cut to black, leaving only the hiss of static. I stared at the empty screen, my mind reeling. These were places I knew intimately. These were people I had grown up with. But this footage wasn't from the past. Somehow, impossibly, it felt immediate and present. A creeping sensation washed over me, the unmistakable feeling of being observed. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but found only the cluttered basement and the soft hum of the old television. I shakily ejected the tape, my hands trembling as I held it. But as I did, I couldn't shake the conviction that something had followed me out of that footage. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild after watching disturbing images. But deep in my gut, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. I needed answers. I had to understand what was happening. Who had filmed these events? Why were they on a tape in my grandmother's basement? And most importantly, why did I feel so personally connected to them? Suddenly, a sound broke the basement silence, the softest footstep from upstairs, barely audible but unmistakably there. The cottage seemed to exhale, settling into itself, and I felt my heart rate spike. Was someone else in the house? I stood slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears, but the sound ceased as quickly as it had begun. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else, but there was only the distant hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of wind through the eaves. I tried to dismiss the anxiety that clung to me like a heavy blanket. I was imagining things, but standing there in the pale basement light, I felt the presence of something unseen, something patient and watchful. Then I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "You're getting closer." It drifted down from somewhere deep within the cottage. I froze. The words echoed in my mind, sending waves of cold through my entire body. I knew with absolute certainty that my nightmare was just beginning. I couldn't move. I stood paralyzed in the basement's dim glow, my ears straining for any hint of that voice again. The cottage felt unnaturally quiet, yet the air itself seemed thick with an invisible presence. The oppressive silence was almost suffocating. "You're getting closer." The words replayed in my head, but this time they felt sharper, more urgent, as if they were coming from within the walls themselves. I slowly turned my head, scanning the shadowy corners of the basement. Every box and forgotten piece of furniture seemed alive with possibility. Every creak of the old wooden beams amplified in the stillness. I shook my head, trying to clear the racing thoughts. "It's just the house settling," I whispered to myself, but even as I spoke the words, I knew they were a lie. This wasn't just an old house making noise. Something was wrong, deeply, terrifyingly wrong. I walked back to the television, my hands shaking as I reached for the VHS tape. I needed to watch it again. I had to understand what I had missed. The final segment, the one filmed inside this very cottage, kept replaying in my mind. That shadow, the way it moved with such unnatural purpose, as if it had been aware of me watching across the decades. The television screen flickered back to life as I inserted the tape again. But this time, when I pressed play, something different appeared. New footage that hadn't been there before, or perhaps I had been too frightened to notice it earlier. The tape showed a folder of additional segments, labeled before the end. My blood ran cold. I was certain this hadn't been there during my first viewing. Without thinking, I selected the first new segment. The footage began, and this time the image was crystal clear. It showed a man walking down Main Street, a young man with familiar features and gait. I had to blink several times to confirm what I was seeing. It was my father, David, but he looked decades younger than I remembered him. The footage was old and grainy, but undeniably him. He was walking toward the old Methodist church, the same one from the earlier segments. His face carried a distant expression, as though he were lost in thought or following some invisible guide. But something felt wrong about the scene. The footage was completely silent. No ambient sound, no footsteps, no wind. It was as if time had been suspended around him, trapping him in a moment that couldn't resolve. As he reached the church steps, a figure emerged from behind a weathered headstone, the same man in the dark coat and wide-brimmed hat. The figure followed my father, never getting too close, but always remaining visible in the frame, a constant presence that felt menacingly deliberate. The camera work was erratic, almost as if the person filming was trying to avoid the figure. But it was always there, lurking at the edges of the shot. The segment ended without warning. I sat there, my mind struggling to process what I had witnessed. My father, why was he in this footage? And who was the figure following him? Why was this tape hidden in my grandmother's basement? I had always known there were things about my family's past that remained unspoken. My father had rarely talked about his childhood in this village, and I had always assumed it was because of some personal trauma he preferred to forget. But this was something entirely different. The second new segment was even more disturbing. It showed the same church, but this time my father wasn't in the frame. The camera focused on the front steps, the ones I had seen him approach in the previous footage. The steps were empty, but there was something about the way the camera lingered on them, something expectant, as if it was waiting for something specific to happen. Then, without warning, a shadow crossed the steps, and I saw him, the figure in the hat. But this time, he was standing directly in front of the church doors, his face still hidden in darkness, but his attention clearly focused on something inside the building. I couldn't breathe. My hand hovered over the remote control, torn between stopping the tape and continuing to watch. I wanted to turn it off, to shut out everything I was seeing, but something inside me insisted I was approaching something crucial, something that would explain everything. I pressed play on the next segment. This one was different. It wasn't filmed with a handheld camera, but rather from what appeared to be a fixed security camera. The footage showed the interior of the church, the same Methodist church that had been abandoned for 30 years. The camera was positioned at the back of the sanctuary, facing the altar. I recognized the setting immediately, even though it had been decades since I had last seen it. The sanctuary was empty, but I could sense something was about to happen. The camera captured the altar area, where old wooden pews sat in neat rows, covered in dust and decay. But it was the altar itself that drew my attention. Standing behind it was the figure in the hat, but now he was closer, clearer. I could make out more details of his appearance. The way his coat hung loosely on his frame, the unnatural stillness of his posture. I watched in growing horror as the figure slowly removed his hat, revealing a face I had never seen before, yet somehow recognized. It was gaunt and pale, with eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera lens and into my soul. The face was neither young nor old, but something in between, as if it existed outside normal time. The figure stared at the camera for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a movement that made my skin crawl, he smiled, a wide, knowing smile that seemed to acknowledge my presence across the decades. Before I could react, the tape cut to black. The television screen went dark. I sat there, staring at the empty screen, unable to process what I had just witnessed. The figure, the church, the connection to my father, it all pointed to something my grandmother had been hiding. Something about our family's history in this village. The words I had heard earlier echoed in my mind. You're getting closer. I had uncovered something, but I wasn't sure I was prepared for what came next. The past was reaching out to me, and it wouldn't be satisfied until I understood the full truth. I grabbed my jacket, my hands still shaking. I needed answers, and I knew where to find them. I had to go to the church. I had to confront whatever was waiting there. The mountain air felt thick and oppressive as I stepped outside, the cool evening breeze doing nothing to calm the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I knew what I had to do. There was no turning back now. Whatever truth lay hidden in that abandoned church had its claws in me, and I couldn't escape its pull. I pulled my jacket tighter as I walked to my car parked beside the cottage. The church was only a few miles away, but with each step, the weight of the gathering darkness seemed to press down on me harder. The familiar village streets felt foreign now, as though the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. I tried to push the images from the tape out of my mind, but they kept flashing before my eyes. The figure in the hat, my father's younger face, the unnatural movements of shadows that seemed to live independently of their sources. I could still hear that voice in my head, soft but insistent. You're getting closer. I tried to convince myself that everything could be explained rationally, that my mind was simply connecting dots that had no real relationship. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. There was something far more sinister at work here, something I was only beginning to understand. The drive to the church was eerily quiet, but the closer I got, the more intense my feeling of dread became. It was as if the very landscape was warning me, urging me to turn around and forget everything I had seen. The old Methodist church appeared through the trees, dark and imposing, like a monument to forgotten secrets. I parked beside the rusted cemetery gates, my headlights casting long shadows across the overgrown graveyard. The church windows were dark, the building appearing lifeless from the outside. But I knew better. I had been in this place before, many times during my childhood. It had always felt like a sanctuary, a place of peace and community. But now, it felt like something else entirely, a tomb where truth had been buried beneath decades of silence. As I walked up the cracked stone path, I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me, heavy with the memories of everything that had happened here. The front doors were chained shut, just as they had been for 30 years. I took out my phone's flashlight and walked around to the side entrance, the one I remembered from my childhood visits with my grandmother. The side door was unlocked, swinging open with a soft groan that echoed through the empty building. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of old wood and dust filling my lungs. But it wasn't just the scent of abandonment. There was something else, something that hadn't been aired out in decades. The church had been empty for so long, but there was a lingering presence here, one that didn't belong to the past. I turned on my phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal the interior I remembered from childhood. The wooden pews were still arranged in neat rows, though now they were covered in dust and debris. The stained glass windows were cracked, allowing thin shafts of moonlight to filter through and create strange patterns on the floor. But it was the altar that drew my attention. The same altar I had seen in the tape, where the figure in the hat had stood and smiled that knowing smile. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The closer I got to the altar, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Behind the altar, partially hidden by shadows, was a door I had never noticed as a child. A door that seemed to call to me now, as if it held the answers I was seeking. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light emanating from beyond it. My heart raced. I hadn't seen anyone enter the church. I was supposed to be alone. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. It revealed a narrow staircase leading down into darkness, but there was an unnatural glow coming from below. Not from an electric light or candle, but from something else. Something that seemed to pulse with its own inner illumination. I made my way down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was larger than I had expected, filled with old church records and forgotten religious artifacts. But it was the far wall that caught my attention. The same wall I had seen in my peripheral vision during the tape footage. I moved toward it, my body tense with anticipation. As I got closer, I could see that part of the wall was different, newer somehow, as if it had been recently modified. There was a section that appeared to have been walled up, but imperfectly, leaving gaps where light seemed to seep through. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. Something was drawing me forward, compelling me to discover what lay behind that wall. I found a loose brick and began to work it free, then another, until I had created an opening large enough to peer through. What I saw on the other side made my blood freeze. It was a small room, barely larger than a closet. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be handwritten notes. But it was the center of the room that drew my attention. A large wooden table sat there, covered with items that made no sense, personal belongings, old letters, and what looked like surveillance equipment from decades past. I squeezed through the opening, my heart pounding as I examined the contents of the room. The photographs were all of people from the village, people I recognized, people I had grown up with. But they weren't normal photographs. They were surveillance shots, taken from a distance, showing people in their daily activities. The dates on the photos span decades, going back to the 1970s. Then I found something that made my hands tremble. A photograph of my father, but not the young man I had seen in the tape. This was my father as I remembered him from my childhood, walking down Main Street with me beside him. But we weren't alone in the photo. Standing in the background, barely visible but unmistakably there, was the figure in the hat. Attached to the photograph was a note in my grandmother's handwriting. "He's been watching our family for 40 years. The cycle must be broken." The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air thick with the weight of something long hidden. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had discovered something that was never meant to be found. My grandmother had been protecting our family from something, and now I had walked directly into its path. I backed away from the table, my mind racing with questions. What cycle? What had been watching our family? And why had my grandmother hidden this room behind a wall? I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft scraping noise coming from somewhere deeper in the church basement. Something or someone was moving in the darkness beyond the room. I wasn't alone anymore. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the stone floor. My heart hammered against my ribs as I spun around, trying to locate the source of the noise. The church basement was a maze of shadows, the air growing thicker with each breath I took. I could see my breath now, small puffs of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. I took a step back toward the opening in the wall, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the hidden room. The shadows seemed to move independently, shifting and writhing as if they were alive. But I couldn't see anything clearly. Everything was just beyond the reach of my phone's flashlight beam. I focused on the sound, trying to identify its origin. It was closer now, no longer just scraping, but accompanied by a rhythmic thudding, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be circling the basement, moving closer to where I stood. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there as fast as possible. But my feet felt rooted to the floor. I didn't know if it was fear, or if something was actually keeping me there, holding me in place, while whatever was out there drew nearer. I thought about the figure from the tape, the man in the hat who had been watching my family for 40 years. The thought sent shivers down my spine. Could it be him? Could he be here now, in this basement, finally ready to complete whatever he had started decades ago? The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I realized with a sickening jolt that they were coming from multiple directions. It wasn't just one person or thing moving through the darkness. There were several of them, all converging on my location. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in from all sides. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. I turned toward the photographs on the wall again, my eyes falling on the images of my family and neighbors. But they looked different now, distorted somehow, as if they were trying to move within their frames. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was here, whatever had been lurking in the shadows of our village for decades, was finally ready to reveal itself. The presence felt ancient and patient, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. Then, through the darkness, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the basement, just beyond the reach of my light. It was tall and thin, wearing the same dark coat and wide-brimmed hat I had seen in the tape. But now, seeing it in person, I could tell that something was fundamentally wrong with its proportions. The limbs were too long, the posture too rigid, as if it was wearing a human form that didn't quite fit. I felt my legs begin to shake, panic rising in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I stood there, transfixed, unable to look away from the figure that had haunted my family for generations. The figure began to move closer, and I could see more details in the dim light. Its face was obscured by shadow, but I could make out the outline of features that seemed to shift and change as I watched. It wasn't entirely human. I was certain of that now. It was something else, something that had been masquerading as human for decades while it stalked my family. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away from me. The figure stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly to one side as if it was studying me. I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing down on me from all directions. Then, in a voice that was both whisper and growl, it spoke. "You found the room." The words were distorted, as if they had to fight their way through some kind of filter or barrier. But they were clear enough. My blood turned to ice, my knees buckling beneath me. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. My throat felt paralyzed, my entire body frozen in terror. The figure moved again, its form seeming to flicker and shift like a badly tuned television signal. It was getting closer, and I could see that it wasn't alone. Other shapes were emerging from the darkness, more figures, all wearing similar dark clothing, all moving with the same unnatural gait. They formed a circle around me, and I realized with growing horror that I was trapped. There was no way out, no escape route that wasn't blocked by one of these things. They stood there silently, watching me, waiting for something. The original figure, the one in the hat, stepped forward. It reached up slowly and removed its hat, revealing a face that made my stomach turn. It was human in basic structure, but wrong in every detail. The eyes were too large, too dark, reflecting no light. The mouth was stretched too wide, forming an expression that might have been a smile, but felt like a threat. "Your grandmother tried to protect you," the figure said, its voice now clearer, but no less disturbing. "But some things cannot be avoided forever." I wanted to ask what it meant, what it wanted from me, but I couldn't form the words. My voice was gone, stolen by fear and the overwhelming presence of these things surrounding me. The figure in the hat took another step closer, and I could smell something awful, decay and old earth, like something that had been buried for too long. It reached out with one long, pale hand, its fingers extending toward my face. "It's time to join the cycle," it whispered. Just as those cold fingers were about to touch my skin, I heard something else, a new sound coming from the staircase behind me. Footsteps, but these were different. Human footsteps, running down the stairs toward the basement. The figures around me turned toward the sound, their attention momentarily diverted. In that instant, I felt control return to my body. Without thinking, I lunged toward the opening in the wall, squeezing through just as a voice called out from the staircase. "Alex, get away from them." I didn't recognize the voice, but I didn't care. I scrambled through the opening and ran toward the stairs, my phone's flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I moved. Behind me, I could hear the figures moving, following, their footsteps echoing through the basement like thunder. I reached the stairs and began climbing, taking them 3 at a time. The voice called out again, closer now, and I could see a figure at the top of the stairs. A woman holding a lantern, her face obscured by shadows. "Hurry," she shouted. "They can't leave the basement, but you need to get out now." I didn't question her words. I ran up the remaining stairs and past her, through the church sanctuary and out into the night air. Only when I was standing in the cemetery, gasping for breath, did I turn to see who had saved me. It was an elderly woman I didn't recognize, wearing a heavy coat and carrying an old-fashioned oil lantern. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "You're Margaret's grandson," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, still too shaken to speak. "I'm Dorothy Mills. I was your grandmother's friend. She asked me to watch over you if anything ever happened to her." She looked back at the church, where the basement door had swung shut. She knew this day would come. "What were those things?" I finally managed to ask. Dorothy's expression grew grim. "Guardians. They've been watching your family for generations, waiting for the right moment to complete their purpose. Your grandmother spent 40 years learning how to keep them at bay, but she knew she couldn't protect you forever." "What do they want?" "To add you to their number. Your family line has something they need, a connection to this place that goes back to the founding of the village. They've been patient, but patience has limits." I looked back at the church, which now appeared completely dark and lifeless. "Is it over?" Dorothy shook her head. "No, they'll wait now, perhaps for years, but they'll never stop watching. You'll need to learn what your grandmother knew. You'll need to understand how to protect yourself and any family you might have someday." She handed me a small leather journal. "This contains everything she discovered about them. Study it carefully. Your survival depends on it." As I took the journal, I realized that my nightmare wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The cycle my grandmother had written about hadn't been broken. It had simply passed to me. And somewhere in the darkness behind us, I could feel them watching, waiting for their next opportunity. But for now, I was still alive, and I had work to do. The moving truck had left 3 hours ago, and I was alone in the house on Maple Street for the first time. The divorce papers were still fresh in my briefcase, and this old Victorian home felt like both a refuge and a prison. I had bought it cheap, too cheap, the realtor had admitted with nervous laughter. But after losing half of everything to Jessica in court, cheap was all I could afford. I should have asked more questions about why the price was so low. The house creaked as I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. The previous owners had left in a hurry, according to the neighbors I had briefly met. The Hendersons next door mentioned something about family troubles before quickly changing the subject. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had given me a casserole and a worried look, telling me to call if I needed anything. Anything at all. I unpacked my essentials first: clothes, toiletries, a few books. The rest of my life was still in boxes stacked in the living room. As evening approached, I noticed how the shadows seemed to gather in the corners of each room, pooling like dark water. The house faced west, so I expected long shadows at sunset, but these felt different. Thicker, more substantial. The first night, I slept on an air mattress in the master bedroom, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak made me tense. Every groan of the old timbers sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was natural. Old houses make noise. They expand and contract with temperature changes. They have character, but character doesn't whisper your name. I woke up at 2:17 in the morning, my heart pounding. The digital clock beside my makeshift bed cast a green glow across the room. I had heard something, a voice, soft and distant, calling Michael. Not Mike, not Mickey, but Michael. The way my mother used to say it when I was in trouble. I sat up, straining to listen. The house was silent except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I convinced myself it was a dream, a product of stress and exhaustion. Moving is traumatic, even when it's your choice, especially when it's your choice. The next morning, I called the utility company about the heating system. The house felt perpetually cold, even though the thermostat read 72 degrees. The technician, a middle-aged man named Bob, arrived around noon and spent an hour checking the furnace in the basement. "System's working fine," he said, climbing back up the basement stairs. "Maybe it's just the age of the house. These old places can be drafty." He paused at the front door, his hand on the doorknob. "You know, I've been in this house before. Previous owners called about the same thing. Cold spots, they said. Never could figure it out." "How many previous owners?" I asked. Bob scratched his head. 3 families in the last 5 years. Don't know why they all moved out so quick." After he left, I decided to explore the basement more thoroughly. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the cool darkness below. The basement was larger than I expected, stretching beneath the entire house. Stone walls, a concrete floor, and a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows in every direction. In the far corner, I found something odd, scratches in the stone wall, deep gouges that formed no recognizable pattern. They looked fresh, as if someone had clawed at the stone with their fingernails. Below the scratches, the concrete floor was stained dark. I knelt down and touched the stain. It was dry, but it had the rusty color of old blood. That night I heard the scratching. It started around midnight, a soft scraping sound coming from somewhere in the walls. I followed the sound through the house, pressing my ear against different walls, trying to pinpoint its location. The scratching seemed to move, traveling from room to room, always staying just ahead of me. I ended up in the kitchen, where the sound was loudest. It was coming from below, from the basement. The scratching was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone trying to dig their way out of something, or dig their way in. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement stairs. The scratching stopped the moment my foot touched the first step. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. I stood there for several minutes, listening, but heard nothing. When I finally descended into the basement, I found new scratches on the wall, longer, deeper than before. The next day, I called Mrs. Patterson and asked if she knew anything about the house's history. She invited me over for coffee, and I could see the concern in her eyes as she poured from her china pot. "The house was built in 1923, she said, settling into her armchair. "The original owner was a man named Theodore Blackwood. He lived there alone for 40 years until he died." "How did he die?" Mrs. Patterson's cup rattled against her saucer. "They found him in the basement. Heart attack, the doctor said. But the strange thing was, he had scratches all over his arms and hands. deep ones, like he'd been fighting something. Fighting what? Nobody knows. The police said he must have fallen down the stairs, tried to crawl to safety. But Michael, she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Theodore was found sitting upright in that corner where you found the scratches. And his fingernails were bloody, torn down to the quick. I thanked her for the coffee and walked back to my house in a daze. The afternoon sun felt warm on my face, but the moment I stepped through my front door, the cold enveloped me again. It wasn't just cold, it was a presence, a weight in the air that made breathing difficult. That evening, I tried to distract myself with television, but the old antenna reception was poor, and the shows kept cutting to static. During one particularly long burst of white noise, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Laughter. It was coming from the static, low and malevolent, like someone finding joy in another's misery. I quickly turned off the TV, but the laughter continued. It was coming from the basement. I knew I should leave. Every instinct screamed at me to pack my things and drive away, to sleep in a motel until I could find another place. But I had invested everything in this house. I had nowhere else to go. The laughter stopped when I reached the basement door. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, listening. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. Finally, I opened the door and flicked on the basement light. The bulb flickered once, twice, then went out. In the darkness, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the concrete floor. They weren't my footsteps. I was still standing at the top of the stairs, frozen with terror. Someone or something was walking around in my basement. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the stairs. The beam of light wavered as my hands shook. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone down there?" The footsteps stopped. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, though I wasn't sure why I was announcing my intentions to an intruder. A voice drifted up from the darkness, not the voice I had heard in my bedroom, but something else. Something older, more tired. "You can't escape what's already here." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs. The voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "This is my house. It has always been my house. You are just another temporary guest." I slammed the basement door shut and ran upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I called the police, but what could I tell them? That I heard voices in my basement, that something was living in my walls. The dispatcher was polite but skeptical. "We'll send someone out to check, sir, but if it's just noises in an old house." "It's not just noises," I said, but I could hear the doubt in my own voice. 2 officers arrived 20 minutes later. They were thorough, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. They found nothing in the basement except the scratches on the wall, which they attributed to previous renovation work. "Old houses can play tricks on your mind," Officer Rodriguez said as they prepared to leave. "Especially if you're here alone. You might want to consider getting a roommate." After they left, I sat in my living room, staring at the basement door. The house felt different now, not just cold, but actively hostile. The shadows seemed to move independently of any light source, and the silence was broken by occasional creaks and groans that didn't sound like settling timbers. I called my brother David in California. We hadn't spoken since the divorce, but I needed to hear a familiar voice. "Mike, Jesus, what time is it there? I think I made a mistake. I said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I think I bought the wrong house." "What do you mean?" I told him everything, the cold spots, the scratches, the voices. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for David. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Mike, you've been under a lot of stress. The divorce, the move, starting over. Maybe you should talk to someone." "I'm not crazy, David." "I didn't say you were, but grief can manifest in strange ways. You lost your wife, your home, your routine. It's natural for your mind to." "It's not my mind," I snapped. "There's something in this house." Another pause. "Okay, if you really believe that, then get out. Come stay with me for a while. We'll figure out how to sell the house." But I couldn't sell the house. I had signed a mortgage that would take 30 years to pay off. I had invested my entire settlement into this place. Running away wasn't an option. That night, I moved my air mattress to the living room, as far from the basement as possible. I barricaded the basement door with a chair, though I knew it wouldn't stop whatever was down there. I was just hoping it would make me feel safer. I was wrong. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of wood splintering. The chair I had placed against the basement door was now in pieces, scattered across the kitchen floor. The basement door stood wide open, and a cold wind was flowing up from the depths below. But there was no wind in the basement. The house was sealed tight. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the doorway. The cold intensified with each step until my breath was visible in the air. At the threshold, I stopped. The basement was no longer empty. Figures moved in the darkness, not solid, but substantial enough to disturb the shadows. They drifted through the basement like smoke, their forms shifting and changing. I counted at least 3 distinct shapes, possibly more. They moved with purpose, as if they were searching for something. Or someone. One of the figures noticed me standing at the top of the stairs. It turned toward me, and I saw what might have been a face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to burn with cold fire. It raised what might have been an arm, pointing directly at me. The other figures stopped their searching and turned toward the stairs. They began to move toward me, their forms becoming more solid, more threatening. I could hear them now, not words, but a sound like wind through dead leaves, like the last breath of a dying man. I ran. I threw some clothes into a bag and fled the house, not bothering to lock the door behind me. I drove to the nearest motel and checked in for the night, my hands still shaking as I signed the register. But I couldn't stay away. The next morning, I drove past the house on Maple Street. From the outside, it looked normal, quaint, even. The morning sun painted the Victorian gingerbread trim in warm golden hues. The lawn was well maintained, the windows sparkled. It was the kind of house that appeared in real estate magazines, the kind that made people dream of simpler times. I parked across the street and watched. Nothing moved in the windows. No shadows drifted behind the curtains. The house looked empty, innocent. Mrs. Patterson came out to get her mail and saw me sitting in my car. She walked over, her face creased with concern. "Michael, dear, are you all right? I saw you leave in quite a hurry last night." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just needed some air." She looked at the house, then back at me. "You know, Theodore Blackwood used to do the same thing. He'd sit in his car at night just staring at the house. Toward the end, he'd stay out there for hours." "What happened to him, really?" Mrs. Patterson sighed. "I think he went mad, Michael. Living alone in that house, hearing things, seeing things. The mind can only take so much isolation before it starts to break. What if he wasn't mad? What if he really was hearing things? She was quiet for a long moment. Then God help you, because it means they're still in there. I spent the day in the motel, trying to convince myself that Mrs. Patterson was right, that I was suffering from stress-induced hallucinations, that the divorce and the move had damaged my mental state more than I realized. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house on Maple Street was not empty. That evening, I drove back to the house, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. My entire life was in that building, not just my possessions, but my future. I couldn't abandon it based on what might be nothing more than an overactive imagination. I approached the front door cautiously, key in hand. The door was unlocked exactly as I had left it. Inside, the house felt different. Not cold this time, but expectant, like it was waiting for something. I walked through the rooms, turning on every light. Nothing was out of place. The broken chair had been cleaned up. The basement door was closed. Someone had been here, but who? And why had they tidied up? I checked the basement door. It was unlocked, but when I opened it, the basement was empty. No figures, no shadows, no evidence of the supernatural activity I had witnessed the night before. Just a normal basement in a normal house. Maybe I was losing my mind. I spent the evening unpacking boxes, trying to make the house feel like home. I hung pictures on the walls, arranged furniture, connected my sound system. The familiar activities were comforting, and by 10 o'clock, I was almost convinced that I had imagined everything. Then I heard the music. It was coming from the basement, a slow, mournful melody that seemed to seep through the floorboards. It sounded like a music box, the kind that plays when you open an old jewelry case. The tune was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I followed the sound to the basement door. The music was definitely coming from below, but it was muffled, as if it was playing from a great distance. I opened the door and descended the stairs. The basement was dark, but I could see a faint glow in the far corner, the same corner where I had found the scratches. As I approached, the music grew louder, clearer. It was Für Elise, played on what sounded like an antique music box. In the corner, sitting on the floor, was a small wooden box. It was old, ornate, with intricate carvings around the edges. The lid was open, and inside, a tiny ballerina spun slowly to the music. The figurine was beautiful, but somehow wrong. Her painted face was too pale, her expression too sad. I knelt down and examined the music box more closely. Engraved on the bottom was a name. Eleanor Blackwood, 1923-1935. A child, Theodore Blackwood had had a daughter, and she had died young. The music box was a memorial, a keepsake of a life cut short. As I held the box, the music slowed, then stopped. The ballerina ceased her spinning and stood motionless. In the sudden silence, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps above my head. Someone was walking through my house. I set the music box down and crept toward the stairs. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. They paused in the kitchen, then continued to the living room. I could hear furniture being moved, drawers being opened and closed. I reached the top of the stairs and peered into the kitchen. The lights were off, but I could see a figure silhouetted against the window. It was tall, thin, wearing what looked like a dark coat. The figure turned toward me, and I saw a face that was both familiar and impossible. It was Theodore Blackwood. I recognized him from an old photograph Mrs. Patterson had shown me. But Theodore Blackwood had been dead for 40 years. He looked at me with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of life. His mouth moved, but no sound emerged. He raised his hand and pointed toward the basement, then faded away like smoke. The music box began playing again. I stood there in the darkness, trying to process what I had seen. Either I was having a complete mental breakdown, or the house on Maple Street was haunted by its former owner. Neither option was particularly comforting. I walked to the basement door and listened. The music continued, but now I could hear something else, a child's laughter, bright and innocent. It was coming from the same corner where I had found the music box. I didn't want to go back down there. Every instinct told me to leave, to run, to never look back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Theodore Blackwood was trying to tell me something, that he was trying to warn me. I descended the stairs once more, my flashlight beam dancing across the stone walls. The music box was still playing, but now there was something else in the corner, a small figure sitting beside it. A child, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and a white dress. She looked up at me with eyes that were too old for her face. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Neither should you," I replied, surprised by my own calmness. She smiled, a sad expression that broke my heart. "I've been here for a very long time. Daddy couldn't leave me alone, so he stayed. Now we're both trapped." "Trapped how?" "The house won't let us go. It feeds on sadness, on fear. It made Daddy sick, made him do things, bad things. He fought it for years, but in the end it won." I knelt down beside her, no longer afraid. "What kind of bad things?" "He hurt people, not on purpose, but the house. It made him angry, violent. The people who lived here after us, they felt it too. They all left, but Daddy and I can't leave. We're part of the house now." "How do I stop it?" Alina looked at the music box, then back at me. "You can't stop it, but you can resist it. Don't let it make you angry. Don't let it make you hurt people. And whatever you do, don't go into the attic." "What's in the attic?" But she was already fading, becoming transparent. "Promise me you won't go up there. Promise me you'll try to get away." "I promise," I said, but she was gone. The music box continued playing, but now it sounded different, not mournful, but warning. I picked it up and carried it upstairs, setting it on the kitchen table. The melody filled the house, and for the first time since I had moved in, the cold receded. I spent the rest of the night researching the house's history online. What I found made my blood run cold. Theodore Blackwood had indeed lived in the house with his daughter Alina. She had died in 1935, officially of pneumonia, but the newspaper reports were suspicious. Neighbors had reported screaming, sounds of violence. Police had investigated, but found no evidence of wrongdoing. After Alina's death, Theodore had become increasingly reclusive. There were reports of strange noises coming from the house, of Theodore being seen talking to empty rooms. He had died in 1963, found in the basement with scratch marks covering his arms and hands. But the deaths hadn't stopped there. In 1978, a family named the Petersons had moved into the house. They lasted 6 months. The father, Robert Peterson, had been arrested for assaulting his wife and children. He claimed the house had poisoned his mind, but the courts didn't buy it. He was committed to a mental institution, where he died 2 years later. The house remained empty until 1985, when a young couple named the Washingtons moved in. They stayed for 8 months. The husband was found dead in the basement, apparently from a heart attack. The wife moved out immediately, claiming the house was evil. The pattern continued through the decades. Families would move in, experience strange phenomena, and either leave quickly or suffer tragedy. Violence, madness, death. The house seemed to corrupt everyone who lived there. And now it was my turn. I closed my laptop and looked around the kitchen. The music box had stopped playing, but I could still feel the presence of Alina and her father. They weren't malevolent. They were trying to help me, to warn me. But they were trapped, bound to the house by some force I couldn't understand. I made a decision. I would stay, but I would fight. I wouldn't let the house win. The next few days were a battle of wills. The house seemed to sense my resistance and escalated its attacks. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the windows. I could hear voices in the walls, whispers that tried to turn my thoughts dark. I fought back with light, with music, with the memory of Alina's warning. I kept the music box playing almost constantly, its melody seeming to provide some protection against the house's influence. I called friends, invited people over, anything to break the isolation that fed the house's power. But it wasn't enough. On the 7th night, I woke to find scratches on my arms, deep gouges that I didn't remember making. The house was winning, turning me into another Theodore Blackwood. I could feel my sanity slipping, my thoughts becoming darker, more violent. I remembered Alina's warning about the attic. Whatever was up there, it was the source of the house's power. I had to face it, even though I had promised her I wouldn't. I climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The attic door was old, painted black, with symbols carved into its surface. They looked like protection wards, but they were old, weakened by time. I opened the door and stepped inside. The attic was larger than I expected, stretching across the entire house. It was filled with furniture covered in white sheets, boxes stacked to the ceiling, and in the center, a circle of candles that burned with black flames. Within the circle was a hole in the floor, not a normal hole, but a void that seemed to extend into infinite darkness. The cold emanated from this opening, along with a sound like distant screaming. I understood now. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a doorway, a portal to someplace else. Someplace dark. Theodore Blackwood had discovered it, and it had driven him mad. He had tried to seal it to protect others, but the effort had cost him his life and his daughter's. The candles were his attempt at containment, but they were burning down. When they went out, the portal would open fully, and whatever was on the other side would be free to enter our world. I had to maintain the seal, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. I called out to Alina and Theodore, begging them to help me. They appeared gradually, becoming more solid as they drew closer to the portal. Theodore looked at me with eyes full of regret. "I tried to destroy it," he said, "but it's too strong. All I could do was contain it." "Then we'll contain it together," I said. We worked through the night, the 3 of us, reinforcing the seal, adding new candles, strengthening the protection ward. It was exhausting work, and I could feel the thing on the other side of the portal fighting us, trying to break through. As dawn approached, the portal began to shrink. The screaming from below grew fainter, and the cold finally began to recede. We had one, at least for now. Theodore and Elena looked at me with something approaching peace. "Thank you," Elena said. "You've given us rest." They faded away, not disappearing, but becoming part of the house itself, guardians rather than prisoners. I knew they would always be there, protecting future residents from the darkness below. I stayed in the house on Maple Street for another year, maintaining the seal, keeping the candles burning. It was a lonely existence, but it was necessary. Eventually, I found another family willing to take on the responsibility. A young couple who understood the truth about the house and were willing to continue the work. As I packed my belongings, I heard the music box playing one last time. Elena's voice whispered through the house, "Thank you for keeping your promise. We can rest now." I left the house on Maple Street, knowing that it would never be truly safe, but also knowing that there were people willing to stand guard against the darkness. Some houses are more than homes, they're prisons, containing things that should never be set free. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find the strength to become a guardian rather than a victim. The house still stands on Maple Street. If you drive by, you might see candles burning in the attic window. That's a good sign. It means someone is still keeping watch, still maintaining the seal that protects us all from what lies beneath. But if you ever see those candles go out, don't go inside. Don't try to help. Just run and pray that whoever comes next is strong enough to light them again. Some doors should never be opened. Some secrets should never be shared. And some houses should never be left unguarded. The darkness is always waiting, just below the surface, ready to break through when we let our guard down. The house on Maple Street is proof that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it scratches at the walls. Sometimes it waits for decades, patient and hungry, until someone strong enough comes along to either feed it or fight it. I chose to fight. I hope you would too. I remember the first time I stepped into Uncle Richard's antique shop and saw it. The mirror, that ancient Venetian glass, wasn't reflecting what it should. I know it sounds impossible, but there it was, mounted on the back wall between two mahogany bookcases, its ornate iron frame twisted into dark roses and thorns. The surface showed something that made my architect's mind struggle to process what I was seeing. It wasn't my reflection staring back at me. It was someone else entirely. The funeral had been 3 days ago. Uncle Richard, found dead in his shop with no clear cause, just gone. The police said his heart simply stopped, but the neighbors whispered about strange lights flickering in the windows after midnight, about voices coming from inside when the shop was supposed to be empty. I'd inherited everything, the cramped shop filled with centuries of collected curiosities, the apartment above, and all the mysteries that came with them. The lawyer had handed me the keys with a nervous smile, mentioning that several previous buyers had backed out after viewing the property. Now I understood why. The shop felt wrong from the moment I'd unlocked the heavy oak door. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight that filtered through grimy windows, illuminating rows of antique furniture, tarnished silver, and oil paintings, whose subjects seemed to track my movement. The air smelled of old wood, melted candle wax, and something else, something metallic and cold. But it was the mirror that drew my attention immediately. Even from across the room, I could feel its presence like a weight pressing against my chest. The Venetian glass dominated the back wall, easily 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, its surface rippling slightly as if it were made of water rather than silver-backed glass. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing on the creaking floorboards. The closer I got, the more details I could make out in the reflection. The figure looking back at me had my height, my build, but the face was all wrong. The eyes were darker, hungrier, and when I raised my hand to test what I was seeing, the reflection didn't mirror the movement. Instead, it smiled. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I stumbled backward, knocking into a display case filled with porcelain dolls. Their glass eyes seemed to follow my movement, tiny painted faces twisted into expressions of malicious amusement. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. Uncle Richard probably had some kind of trick mirror installed, a novelty item for customers. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they were lies. The reflection in the mirror tilted its head, studying me with an intelligence that felt ancient and predatory. When I took a step to the left, it remained perfectly still, centered in the frame like a portrait. I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the inventory sheets Uncle Richard had left scattered across the counter. According to his notes, the mirror had been acquired in 1987 from an estate sale in Salem. The previous owner, a woman named Margaret Thornfield, had insisted it be sold immediately after her husband's death. She'd refused to explain why, only repeating that it needs to go to someone who can handle it. My hands shook as I read the description. Venetian mirror, circa 1700s, possibly cursed. Buyer assumes all risks. Cursed, Uncle Richard had actually written that word in his meticulous handwriting. A soft scraping sound made me look up. The reflection was moving now, not just shifting position, but actually walking within the confines of the mirror's frame. It paced back and forth like a caged animal, its movements jerky and unnatural. Every few steps, it would stop and press its palms against the glass from the other side, as if testing the strength of whatever barrier kept it trapped. The temperature in the shop dropped noticeably. My breath began to mist in the air, and frost started forming on the windows despite the warm September weather outside. The candles scattered throughout the shop, Uncle Richard's preferred lighting, flickered and dimmed, their flames dancing in a non-existent breeze. I backed toward the door, but my feet felt leaden, unwilling to carry me away from whatever force was emanating from the mirror. The reflection had stopped pacing and was now standing directly in front of the glass, its face pressed close to the surface. I could see the fog of its breath clouding the mirror from within. "Marcus," it whispered, and somehow I could hear the voice despite the barrier between us. The sound was like breaking glass, sharp and cutting. Marcus Reynolds. Hearing my name spoken by that thing sent a jolt of terror through me. How could it know who I was? How could it speak at all? "You're not real," I said, louder this time, trying to inject some authority into my voice. "You're just a reflection, a trick of the light." The thing in the mirror laughed, a sound like winter wind through bare branches. "I'm more real than you know, Marcus. I've been waiting so long for someone like you, someone who belongs to this family." Family, the word hit me like a physical blow. Uncle Richard had never married, had no children. As far as I knew, I was his only living relative. But what did that have to do with this mirror, this thing that wore my face? "Your uncle tried to resist," the reflection continued, pressing its hands flat against the glass. He lasted almost 40 years, but in the end, he couldn't fight what runs in your blood, what calls to the glass. I thought about Uncle Richard's final weeks, how he'd become increasingly paranoid and reclusive. He'd stopped returning phone calls, had groceries delivered rather than leave the shop. The few times I'd visited, he'd seemed distracted, constantly glancing toward the back wall where the mirror hung. He never told you about the family history, did he? The reflection asked, its voice growing stronger, more confident. About your great-great-grandfather, Thomas Reynolds, who commissioned this mirror in Venice. About what he bound inside it. The room began to spin around me. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself as waves of dizziness washed over me. The air felt thick, almost liquid, making it hard to breathe. Thomas was a collector like your uncle, the reflection continued. But he collected more than just objects. He collected souls, Marcus. Trapped them in glass and silver, bound them with blood and ritual. And when he died, his own spirit joined the collection. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the fog that was settling over my thoughts. That's impossible. You're lying. Am I? The reflection gestured to the shop around us. Look at this place, Marcus. Really look. Do you think your uncle collected all these things by chance? Every mirror, every reflective surface, they're all connected, part of the same web. For the first time, I truly observed my surroundings. The shop was filled with mirrors of every size and style. Hand mirrors scattered across tables, full-length mirrors leaning against walls, even the glass fronts of the display cases, all of them reflecting not just the room, but something more. In each reflective surface, I could see shadows moving, shapes that weren't quite human. The family curse, the reflection said, its voice now coming from multiple directions at once. Passed down through generations, each keeper of the collection adding to it, feeding it, until they become part of it themselves. I stumbled toward the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. The metal was ice cold under my palm, and no matter how hard I twisted, it remained locked. Behind me, I could hear the sound of glass beginning to crack. I turned back to see spider web fractures spreading across the surface of the Venetian mirror. But instead of breaking inward, the cracks seemed to be spreading outward, reaching toward me like grasping fingers. You can't leave, Marcus, the reflection said, its image now distorted by the fractures, but somehow more real than before. This is your inheritance, your birthright. Uncle Richard understood that, eventually. He stopped fighting and accepted his place in the collection. The temperature dropped further. Frost covered every surface now, and the candles began to gutter and die one by one. In the growing darkness, the only light came from the mirrors themselves, each one glowing with a pale, sickly luminescence. I pressed my back against the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The reflection had stepped closer to the fractured glass, and I could see that it was no longer alone. Other figures moved behind it in the mirror's depths, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All with the same face, all with the same dark, hungry eyes. Every Reynolds who's owned this collection, the reflection explained, noticing my horrified stare. Every keeper who's fed the mirrors with their years, their sanity, their soul. We're all here, Marcus, waiting for you to join us. One of the cracks in the mirror spread wide enough for something to push through. Not a hand exactly, but something that might have been a hand once, now twisted and elongated, reaching toward me across the impossible distance. I ducked to the side, grabbing the first thing I could find, a heavy brass candlestick. Without thinking, I hurled it at the mirror. The impact sent a shower of glass fragments across the floor, but the mirror didn't break. Instead, the hole I'd created began to seal itself, the glass flowing like liquid to repair the damage. "You only make it stronger," the reflection said, its voice now coming from behind me. "Violence feeds it, fear feeds it, and you, Marcus, are full of both." I spun around to find the thing standing in the shop with me, no longer confined to the mirror's surface. It looked exactly like me, but wrong in every detail: skin too pale, eyes too dark, movements too fluid. It wore my face like a mask, but underneath, I could sense something vast and hungry. "How?" I gasped, backing away until I hit the wall. "The barrier weakens with each generation," it said, circling me like a predator. "Your uncle's death broke the last of the old protections. The mirrors are free to claim what's theirs." I looked around desperately for another weapon, another escape route, but the shop seemed to have grown larger, the walls stretching away into darkness. The mirrors multiplied, covering every surface, each one showing a different reflection of the same scene: me, cornered and terrified, surrounded by hungry shadows. "Why me?" I whispered. "Because you're the last," the reflection replied. "The last Reynolds. When you join us, the collection will be complete. The mirrors will be free to expand, to claim new families, new bloodlines. You're not just the end of your family line, Marcus. You're the beginning of something much larger." The shop began to dissolve around me, the walls and furniture fading into mist. Only the mirrors remained, floating in a void of absolute darkness. I stood alone in the center of this impossible space, surrounded by countless reflections of myself, each one slightly different, each one wrong. "Choose," the reflection said, its voice echoing from every direction. "Join us willingly, and the transition will be gentle. Fight, and we'll take what we need anyway. But either way, you belong to the glass now." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sight of all those distorted faces, all those hungry stares. But I could still feel them watching, waiting, pressing closer with each passing second. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the shop. The mirrors still covered every surface, but the reflections were normal now, just me, standing alone among the antiques. The temperature had returned to normal, and the candles burned steady and bright. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that it had all been a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown brought on by Uncle Richard's death, and the burden of inheriting his mysterious collection. Then I caught sight of myself in the Venetian mirror. My reflection smiled back at me, but I wasn't smiling. My mouth was set in a grim line, my eyes wide with fear. But the thing in the mirror looked pleased, satisfied, as if it had just won a long and difficult game. I raised my hand to my face, touching my cheek. The reflection didn't mirror the movement. Instead, it pressed its palm against the glass from the other side, and I felt the cold touch of its fingers on my skin. "Welcome to the collection, Marcus," it whispered, and this time the voice came from my own throat. "We've been waiting for you." I tried to scream, but no sound came. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, not in the mirror, but in my own body, watching helplessly as something else took control. The reflection stepped back from the glass, and I felt my own body move in response. I was the reflection now, I realized. The thing in the mirror was me, and I was just an observer, a passenger in my own flesh. My hands, but not my hands, reached out to touch the mirror's surface. The glass rippled like water, and I felt the cold flow of something ancient and hungry pouring into me, filling the empty spaces, pushing out whatever had made me Marcus Reynolds. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was the sound of my own voice, speaking words I didn't choose. The collection is complete. Let the expansion begin. When I woke up, I was standing in front of a bathroom mirror in a house I didn't recognize. The face looking back at me was younger, female, with blonde hair and green eyes. But the expression was familiar, confused, frightened, just beginning to realize that something was terribly wrong. Behind her in the reflection, I could see myself, the real me, pressing against the glass from the other side. I was part of the collection now, part of the web of mirrors that span the country, maybe the world. And this new victim, this stranger whose life we were about to claim, had no idea what was about to happen. I tried to warn her, tried to mouth the words "run" or "break the mirror." But I had no voice in this place between reflections. I could only watch as she leaned closer to the glass, drawn by the same inexorable force that had claimed me. The cycle was beginning again. The collection was growing, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of glass breaking, reality fracturing, as the mirrors claimed another soul. I thought about Uncle Richard, about all the Reynolds who had come before, about the generations of collectors who had fed this thing with their lives. We were all here now, all part of the same hungry presence that wore 1,000 faces and spoke with 1,000 voices. The girl in the bathroom was reaching toward the mirror now, her fingertips almost touching the surface. In a few moments, she would be gone, and something else would be wearing her face, walking through her life, searching for the next victim. I wanted to close my eyes, to turn away from what was about to happen. But I couldn't. None of us could. We were all trapped here, all forced to watch as the collection grew, as the mirrors spread their influence further and further into the world. The glass rippled under her touch, and I felt the familiar cold flow of power, the sensation of another soul being drawn into the web. The girl's eyes widened in terror as she realized what was happening, but it was too late. It was always too late. The mirrors were patient. They had waited centuries for this moment, for the chance to break free of their confines and claim the world. And now, with the last of the Reynolds bloodline absorbed into their collective consciousness, nothing could stop them. The reflection smiled with the girl's face, and I knew that somewhere else, in some other mirror, the real girl was screaming silently as she took her place in the collection. The expansion had begun. The mirrors were free, and we were all part of it now, willing or not, feeding the hunger that could never be satisfied. I am the reflection in the glass. I am the shadow in the silver. I am the darkness between the mirrors, and I am growing stronger with each soul we claim. Soon every reflective surface will be a doorway. Every mirror will be a trap, and everyone will join the collection, whether they want to or not. The glass is patient, the glass is hungry, and the glass always wins in the end. I woke to the sound of scratching. The bedroom was bathed in silver moonlight that filtered through the oak trees outside. My grandfather's old farmhouse creaked and settled around me, the wooden beams groaning like old bones. I had inherited this place 6 months ago, and still wasn't used to its nighttime symphony. But this sound was different, deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across glass. I sat up slowly, the ancient bed springs protesting beneath me. The scratching continued, coming from the direction of the large window that faced the backyard. Through the sheer curtains, I could see the silhouette of the forest beyond, its tree line dark and jagged against the star-filled sky. I held my breath and listened. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. It pressed against my eardrums, thick and expectant. Even the usual chorus of crickets and night birds had gone quiet. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. The house was old, built in 1943, and it had no central heating. The chill seemed to seep up through the floorboards and into my bones. Step by careful step, I approached the window. The curtains were thin, almost transparent in the moonlight. I could see through them easily enough, but something made me hesitate. Some primal instinct that screamed at me to stay back, to return to bed and pull the covers over my head. But I had to know. I reached out and grasped the edge of the curtain. My fingers trembled as I pulled it aside, just an inch. The backyard stretched out before me, bathed in ethereal silver light. The old oak tree stood sentinel in the center, its gnarled branches reaching toward the house like arthritic fingers. Beyond it, the forest waited, dark and impenetrable. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. In the moonlight, it looked like a shadow that had been stretched and twisted into the shape of a person. But it wasn't a person. I knew that with the same certainty that I knew my own name. The thing's head was tilted upward, angled toward my window. Though I couldn't make out any features, I felt its attention like a physical weight. It was watching me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to step back, to let the curtain fall and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the motionless figure in my backyard. The moonlight flickered as a cloud passed overhead, and when it cleared, the figure was gone. I stumbled backward, gasping. My legs hit the edge of the bed, and I sat down hard, my whole body shaking. Had I imagined it? Had it been a trick of the shadows, some strange configuration of branches and moonlight that my tired brain had mistaken for something sinister? The scratching started again. This time, it was coming from downstairs. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. The same deliberate, rhythmic scratching I had heard before. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen, from the direction of the back door. Something was trying to get in. I forced myself to stand, though my legs felt like water. There was a baseball bat in the closet, a relic from my high school days that I had brought along when I moved in. I grabbed it, my knuckles white around the handle. The scratching continued, patient and persistent. I crept toward the bedroom door, which I had left slightly ajar. The hallway beyond was dark, illuminated only by the faint moonlight that spilled from my room. The old house suddenly felt enormous around me, full of shadows and hiding places. I stepped into the hallway. The wooden floor was cold beneath my feet, and every board seemed to creak and groan as I made my way toward the stairs. Behind me, my bedroom door swung shut with a soft click. I hadn't touched it. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The door was closed, the brass handle gleaming in the dim light. I reached for it, my free hand shaking. It wouldn't turn. I twisted the handle again, harder this time. Nothing. The door was locked, though there was no lock on the inside. It was as if something was holding it shut from within. A new sound reached my ears, a low, mechanical whir coming from downstairs. The answering machine. Someone was leaving a message. I abandoned the door and crept toward the stairs, the bat clutched tightly in my hands. Each step seemed to echo through the house, though I tried to move as quietly as possible. The old wood betrayed me, creaking and popping under my weight. At the bottom of the stairs, I paused. The kitchen was to my left, the living room to my right. The answering machine sat on a small table by the front door, its red light blinking steadily. The mechanical voice filled the silence. "You have one new message." There was a pause, then a click as the message began to play. At first, there was only static. Then, beneath the white noise, I heard something else. A voice, so faint it was almost inaudible. It seemed to be whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. The message lasted exactly 30 seconds, then ended with another click. End of messages. I stared at the machine, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Who would call at this hour? And what had they said? The scratching from the kitchen had stopped. I turned toward the back of the house, raising the bat. The kitchen doorway was a rectangle of deeper darkness, and I couldn't see what lay beyond, but I could feel something watching me from within. I took a step forward, then another. The silence was absolute now, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I reached the kitchen doorway and peered inside. The room was empty, bathed in the same silver moonlight that filled the rest of the house. The back door stood closed, its deadbolt securely in place. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the window above the sink was open. I was certain I had closed it before bed. I always did, a habit from city living that I hadn't been able to shake. But now it gaped wide, the night air flowing through it like a cold river. I approached the window slowly, the bat raised and ready. Outside, the backyard looked exactly as it had from upstairs, empty, peaceful, normal. The oak tree swayed gently in the breeze, its leaves rustling with a sound like whispered secrets. I reached for the window, intending to close it. My fingers touched something wet. I jerked my hand back, my heart hammering. In the moonlight, I could see dark streaks on the glass, not water, but something thicker. Something that caught the light and gleamed like oil. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely find it. The fluorescent bulb flickered to life, harsh and bright after the gentle moonlight. The streaks on the glass were dark red blood. On the outside of the window, someone had drawn symbols in blood. They were crude, primitive-looking things that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to writhe and shift in the fluorescent light, as if they were alive. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. The bat fell from my numb fingers, clattering against the linoleum floor. The answering machine beeped from the other room. "You have one new message." I stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the bloody symbols on the glass. The message played in the background, another 30 seconds of static and whispered words I couldn't understand. When it ended, the machine beeped again. "You have one new message," and again, "You have one new message." Each message was the same 30 seconds of static and whispers, followed by the mechanical beep. But with each repetition, the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. By the fifth message, I could make out words. Alex. My name, spoken in a voice that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "Alex, we know you're listening." The sixth message was longer, the voice more insistent. Alex, you shouldn't have come here. This place remembers. It knows what you are. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound. But it seemed to come from inside my head now, reverberating through my skull like an echo in a cavern. Alex, we've been waiting for you. The seventh message was different. Instead of the whispered voice, I heard something else, a sound like breathing, slow and deliberate. But it was wrong somehow, too long and too deep, as if whatever was breathing had lungs the size of caverns. I ran toward the living room, desperate to unplug the machine. But as I reached the doorway, I stopped. The machine wasn't alone. Figures stood throughout the living room, tall and impossibly thin, their bodies stretching toward the ceiling like shadows cast by a dying fire. There were dozens of them, maybe more, filling every corner and crevice of the space. They were all facing the answering machine, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle, listening. I took a step backward, my breath catching in my throat. The figures didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. They simply stood there, patient and still, as if they had been waiting for centuries. The machine beeped again. You have one new message. This time the voice was clear, unmistakable. It was my own voice, speaking words I had never said. I let them in, my voice said through the machine. I opened the door. I invited them inside. The figures turned toward me in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized. Though they had no faces, I could feel their attention like a physical weight. Now they're here, my voice continued. Now they're home. The figures began to move. They didn't walk so much as flow, their bodies rippling and undulating like liquid shadow. They moved toward me slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. I turned and ran, back through the kitchen, toward the back door. My fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, slipping on the metal. Behind me, I could hear them coming, their movements accompanied by a sound like wind through dry leaves. The door flew open, and I stumbled into the night. The backyard was transformed. What had been empty grass and scattered leaves was now filled with figures, hundreds of them, standing silent and still beneath the oak tree. They formed concentric circles around the house, their bodies swaying gently in the breeze. They were all watching me. I ran toward the forest, crashing through the underbrush. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind me, the house glowed with an unnatural light, and I could hear my own voice still speaking through the answering machine. I brought them home, it said. I brought them all home. I reached the tree line and plunged into the darkness. The forest was alive with whispers. They seemed to come from every direction, a chorus of voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The trees themselves seemed to be listening, their branches bending toward me like ears. I ran deeper into the woods, my lungs burning. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed, that I was being watched, that I was being herded. I stumbled into a small clearing and fell to my knees, gasping. The whispers had stopped, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that I had escaped. Then I looked up. The figures surrounded the clearing, standing just beyond the tree line. They were perfectly still, perfectly silent, waiting. I understood then that there was no escape. There never had been. The house, the messages, the symbols, it had all been a trap designed to bring me to this moment, to bring me home. I closed my eyes and waited. When I opened them again, I was back in my bedroom. The morning sun streamed through the windows, and birds sang in the oak tree outside. Everything looked normal, peaceful, exactly as it should be. But I knew better now. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard. It was empty, just grass and trees and morning light. But I could feel them watching me from the shadows, patient and eternal. They had been waiting for me to come home, and now I was here to stay. I picked up my phone from the nightstand. The screen was cracked, though I couldn't remember dropping it. There was a text message from an unknown number sent at 3:47 in the morning. "Welcome home, Alex." I deleted the message and set the phone aside. Then I walked downstairs to make breakfast, humming softly to myself. The answering machine blinked steadily on the table by the front door, its red light pulsing like a heartbeat. I had 47 new messages, but I didn't need to listen to them. I already knew what they would say. The house creaked and settled around me, and I smiled. It was good to be home, good to be where I belonged. Outside, the figures waited in the forest, patient and still. They would always be there, watching, waiting, and I would never be alone again. Have you ever wondered if roads can remember? Not the way historians document changes over decades, with new shops opening and old landmarks disappearing, but as if the concrete itself possessed memory, shifting its patterns when you least expected it. I never considered such a possibility until that foggy November night. It was nearly 1 in the morning when I finally left the downtown office complex. The quarterly presentation had dragged on for hours, and my patience had worn thin. All I wanted was to reach my apartment across town and forget about spreadsheets and profit margins. The evening fog had rolled in thick from the bay, wrapping around streetlights like ghostly fingers. The air tasted of salt and exhaust fumes. I turned onto Riverside Drive, a route I had taken countless times, or so I believed. The first hint that something was amiss came when I passed the Moonlight Diner for the second time. Initially, I dismissed it as exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Perhaps I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Perhaps the long day had clouded my judgment. But when it happened again, I could not ignore the evidence. The blue and white neon sign flickered at me mockingly. The same weathered parking lot. The same rusty mailbox standing crooked by the entrance. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "This cannot be happening," I whispered to myself. I continued driving forward. The road stretched endlessly into the murky darkness like a tunnel with no end. The GPS on my dashboard began acting strangely, displaying roads that did not exist before resetting completely. No signal available. The streetlights grew sparse and dim. The familiar office buildings faded into obscure shapes. The cityscape I knew so well transformed into something alien. The intersections no longer followed any logical pattern. I could have sworn Riverside Drive was a straight shot to my neighborhood. Yet here I was, trapped in an impossible maze. That was when I first noticed the watchers. They appeared as vague silhouettes at first, barely visible through the thick fog. Dark forms stationed at the edges of the pavement, too distant to discern any features. They remained perfectly still, neither walking nor shifting their positions. They simply stood there, observing. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I pressed harder on the accelerator. The engine roared to life, tires squealing against the damp asphalt, but Riverside Drive seemed to extend infinitely before me. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The watchers had moved closer, not running, not pursuing, just closer than before. My breathing became shallow and rapid. My fingers ached from clutching the wheel so tightly. I needed to escape this place immediately. I jerked the steering wheel left, taking the next available turn without hesitation. And there it was again, the Moonlight Diner. The neon sign pulsed rhythmically. The same cracked parking lot, the same rusty mailbox. My heart lurched in my chest. This was impossible. This defied every law of physics I understood. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a jarring halt. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached for my phone once more. The screen showed the same message: no signal available. The fog thickened around me, pressing against the windows like curious hands. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting to the side mirror. The watchers had vanished, but instinct told me they were still out there, hidden in the mist. I was not alone on this road, and I had no idea how to leave it. The fog continued to thicken, each wisp curling around my car like seeking tendrils. It transformed the world beyond my windshield into a shifting wall of gray and white. I turned on the fog lights, but they only made things worse, reflecting the mist back at me in blinding sheets. The Moonlight Diner remained in front of me, its presence both familiar and threatening. I forced myself to think rationally. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the fog was disorienting me more than I realized. Maybe I was driving in circles without paying proper attention to the road signs. But deep in my gut, I knew that was not true. I checked my phone again. The battery had dropped from 80% to 30% in what felt like minutes. That was not normal behavior for any device. An uncomfortable weight settled in my chest. I looked in the rearview mirror once more. The road behind me disappeared into the fog, empty and silent. No watchers, no headlights from other vehicles, just an endless void of swirling mist. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I had two options: sit here paralyzed by fear or keep moving forward. I chose to drive. Taking a deep breath, I shifted into gear and pressed the accelerator gently. The car rolled forward slowly, and I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the diner as I passed it. This time, I would take a different route. I would find my way out of this maze. The road curved gently to the right, leading past a row of small motels. I felt my shoulders relax slightly. These buildings looked familiar. I recognized the Pine Valley Motel with its vintage sign and the small parking lot filled with aging cars. Finally, I was making progress. I allowed myself a brief, nervous laugh. Maybe I really had been imagining things after all. Then I saw it ahead of me, the Moonlight Diner again. My breath caught in my throat. My hands went numb with shock. I hit the brakes hard, the car skidding slightly on the moisture-slicked pavement. The neon sign flickered its blue and white message into the foggy night. This is not possible. I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed to do something different. I could not continue driving in circles, hoping the road would somehow fix itself. I examined the motels around me more carefully. Now, under closer inspection, they did not look quite as familiar as I had thought. The windows were dark and empty. The fog lights cast weak, sickly yellow pools on the cracked sidewalks. No other cars moved through the area. No people walked the streets. Just rows of abandoned buildings stretching into the distance like tombstones in a forgotten cemetery. A single street sign stood at the nearby corner, its metal surface corroded and stained. Through the fog, I could barely make out the words. Riverside Drive. My stomach dropped like a stone. How was this possible? I had turned off Riverside Drive. I had seen different roads, different buildings. I had driven through what felt like miles of unfamiliar territory. A soft tapping sound reached my ears, gentle but persistent, like fingernails against glass. The sound came from my passenger window. I froze completely. The tapping continued. Slow, deliberate, patient. I turned my head with excruciating slowness. A figure stood inches from my car window. No umbrella, no raincoat. Simply standing there in the thick fog, their head tilted at an unnatural angle that made my skin crawl, watching me. I could not make out their face clearly. The fog and condensation on the glass distorted everything, turning them into a featureless shadow. My lungs forgot how to work. I wanted to floor the accelerator, to speed away from this nightmare, but my body had turned to stone. Because the figure was not alone. More shapes emerged from the fog, stepping onto the pavement with silent footsteps. Dozens of them. They moved with the same eerie stillness, their heads all tilted at identical angles. All of them staring at me. I grabbed the gear shift with shaking hands. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, they all took a single step forward, in perfect unison. I could not breathe, could not think, could not process what I was seeing. The figure at my window remained motionless, but the others continued their slow, synchronized advance. They did not walk like normal people. They glided across the ground with fluid, inhuman movements. My survival instincts finally kicked in. I slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas. The tires screamed against the wet pavement as I backed away from the approaching figures. Through my peripheral vision, I could see them adjusting their positions, maintaining their formation as they followed my movement. I threw the car into drive and spun the wheel hard, accelerating down Riverside Drive once again. The fog rushed past my windows like a living thing, and the figures faded into the gray behind me. But I knew they were still there, everywhere I looked. I passed the street sign for the fourth time now. Riverside Drive. The letters seemed to mock me, taunting me with their impossibility. The pavement beneath my tires felt unstable, as if the road itself was shifting and changing. Reality seemed to be coming apart at the seams. Then, through the fog ahead, I spotted something I had not seen before. A light. It glowed softly in the distance, cutting through the mist like a beacon. I could not tell if it was a street light or something else entirely, but it represented hope. It was different from everything else in this twisted version of Riverside Drive. I had to reach it. My headlights flickered as I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The speedometer needle climbed higher and higher, but the fog made it impossible to judge my actual speed. The world outside became a blur of gray and white. The light grew larger as I approached, pulsing with a warm, golden glow. I focused all my attention on reaching it, ignoring the shapes that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. The buildings around me became indistinct smears of color and shadow. The light was so close now. Just a few more seconds, it pulsed once, twice, and then Riverside Drive simply ended. The asphalt beneath my wheels vanished completely, leaving my car suspended in empty space for one terrifying moment that lasted forever. I stomped on the brakes, but there was nothing to stop against. No road, no ground, no support. I was falling through nothingness. The headlights illuminated only fog and darkness. No watchers, no diner, no light, everything had disappeared. And then consciousness left me entirely. I awakened to the sound of my own ragged breathing. For several moments, I could not remember where I was or how I had gotten there. The world around me was dark, but this darkness felt different from the oppressive void I had experienced before. This felt real. I blinked repeatedly, trying to adjust to the gloom, but my vision remained clouded. The air carried the scent of damp earth and something metallic that made my mouth taste bitter. I had no memory of how I had arrived in this place. The last clear image in my mind was the sensation of falling, the terrible moment when the road disappeared beneath me. But now I was standing on solid ground, surrounded by something I could not yet identify. I reached out cautiously, my fingers encountering something cold and rigid. Metal. I jerked my hand back instinctively. It was a fence. A tall chain-link barrier that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. I became aware of another sound cutting through the silence. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing steadily closer. I remained perfectly still, my heart skipping beats as the footsteps approached. They mixed with the rapid pounding of my pulse until I could barely distinguish between them. Who could be out here in this darkness? I strained to hear any other clues about my situation. That was when I noticed the whispers. Soft, indistinct voices drifting from the shadows around me. I could not make out the words, but they seemed to be getting closer, as if invisible speakers were slowly surrounding me. My instincts screamed at me to move, and I took a step backward. The gravel beneath my feet crunched loudly in the silence, but the footsteps maintained their steady rhythm, never faltering or changing pace. Was something tracking me? I backed up further, my fingers brushing against the sharp edges of the fence. The whispers grew more intense, and a chill ran down my spine like ice water. I wanted to call out, to demand answers, but my throat had closed up completely. Then I heard a new sound, a low, grinding creak. The fence was moving, not swaying in the wind, but actually bending and shifting, as if some massive force was manipulating it from the other side. A figure materialized from the darkness ahead of me. I could not see its face or features, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. It carried the same unnatural stillness that I had encountered before, the same oppressive aura. This was not human, not entirely. It was something else, something that should not exist. I spun around and ran, my boots pounding against the gravel with sharp, echoing sounds. The fence stretched on forever beside me, but I had no choice except to keep moving. The figure behind me moved with frightening grace, its footsteps matching my own pace exactly. No matter how fast I ran, no matter which direction I turned, it remained behind me. I could not outrun it. Without warning, the ground beneath my feet shifted again. I was no longer running on solid earth. I was falling once more. I crashed into the ground hard, my body tumbling across the rough surface. Pain shot through my hands and knees as I scraped against stones and dirt. My head spun violently, and the world tilted at impossible angles. I struggled to push myself upright, but the air felt thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe properly. I looked up. The figure stood directly above me now, no longer moving. It was watching me with an intensity that I could feel in my bones. Its presence was so alien, so fundamentally wrong, that my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. I tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but no sound emerged from my throat. For what felt like hours, time seemed frozen. The figure loomed over me, its form radiating an otherworldly menace that made my skin crawl. Then, without any warning, it simply vanished. The oppressive weight lifted from the air. The whispers stopped abruptly, but I understood now. I was not alone in this place, and somehow I was still not back on Riverside Drive. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I could not remain here. I could not stay in this nightmare. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. The darkness seemed to pulse around me like a living thing, but I could not give in to panic. I had to move. I had to find a way out of this maze, away from the figure, away from this place that defied all logic and reason, away from whatever force was holding me here. So I ran again, stumbling through the darkness. And this time, I did not dare look back. The atmosphere around me felt heavier now, as if the very air was becoming denser with each breath I took. My lungs burned with the effort of drawing in oxygen, and every step forward required more energy than it should have. My footsteps echoed strangely in the darkness, producing hollow sounds that seemed to bounce off invisible walls. I refused to slow down. I could not afford to stop. The figure may have disappeared, but the sensation of being watched, of being hunted, clung to me like a second skin. I had to find an escape route. The path I was following no longer resembled Riverside Drive or any road I had ever seen. I could not even remember how I had ended up in this forsaken place. One moment I was driving home from work. The next I was trapped in this labyrinth of impossible geometry and shifting reality. The landscape around me had transformed completely. Twisted trees lined the pathway, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to snare me. When the wind moved through their leaves, it created sounds that were all wrong, too harsh, too brittle, like bones scraping against stone. The world felt alive in ways that nature never intended. It was breathing, pulsing, pressing against me from all directions with malevolent intent. I pushed myself to keep moving, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound of my own breathing was deafening in the silence. I should have turned around. I should have tried to retrace my steps back to some point of familiarity. But that instinct felt like a trap, as if going backward would only make my situation worse. There was only one direction that made sense: forward. The path ahead of me stretched like a dark ribbon, dimly lit by what appeared to be streetlights in the distance. Their pale glow created long, dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. But there were no other signs of life. No vehicles, no people, no evidence of civilization, just me, alone in this twisted version of reality. I quickened my pace, desperate to find anything that might offer hope or direction. As I pressed through the undergrowth, I noticed that the pavement beneath my feet was changing. The smooth asphalt was giving way to cracked concrete, then to gravel, then to bare earth mixed with broken stones. The sound of my footsteps grew louder and more pronounced, creating a rhythmic crunching that echoed through the silence. My breathing became shallow and rapid as panic began to set in again. Then I heard it, a sound that made my heart leap with hope, an engine. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening intently. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the rumble of a car engine growing steadily louder. I turned toward the source of the noise, straining my eyes against the darkness. Hope flickered in my chest for the first time since this nightmare began. There had to be someone else here, someone who could help me understand what was happening. I waited as the sound approached, the engine noise becoming more distinct with each passing second. But as it drew nearer, I realized that something was wrong. The headlights were not bright white beams cutting through the darkness. They were dim and yellowish, casting a sickly glow that barely penetrated the shadows. And the vehicle itself was not behaving like a normal car. It was not a car at all. It was a shadow given form. The thing moved slowly and silently, its outline barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. The wheels did not appear to be touching the ground. Instead, it seemed to glide just above the surface, floating like a ghost. The engine sound was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The vehicle stopped directly in front of me, and the engine noise cut out abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. I could not move, could not breathe, could not look away. The door opened with a rusty creak. I could not see who or what was inside, but I could sense a presence there, something dark and patient, studying me through the tinted windows. The door swung wider, and a figure stepped out, tall and impossibly thin. It moved with the same deliberate, unnatural grace I had witnessed before. I should have run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and flee, but my muscles had locked up completely. Fear had paralyzed me. The figure took a step closer, then another. My mouth went dry, and my pulse accelerated with each movement. I had no idea what this thing wanted or what it was capable of. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me, and in the oppressive silence, it spoke. "Why do you keep running from us?" The voice was smooth and strangely soothing, but it made my skin crawl. It sounded almost human, but there was something fundamentally wrong with it, as if it was mimicking human speech without truly understanding it. "I do not know what you want," I managed to croak, my voice barely audible. "What we want," the figure's head tilted at that same unnatural angle. "No one knows what they want here, not anymore." My legs finally found the strength to move, and I took a step backward. But the figure was already there, blocking my path with impossible speed. It had not made a sound while moving. The air around it felt colder than ice. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice breaking. The figure did not respond immediately. Instead, it seemed to be examining me, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Its eyes, hidden deep within the shadows of its face, were like black holes that pulled at my very soul. "We are what remains," it said finally. "What lingers when the road forgets itself?" I took another step back, my mind reeling. And then, without any warning, the figure stepped aside and dissolved back into the shadows, as if it had never existed. The phantom vehicle faded away as well, leaving me alone in the darkness once more. I stood there, gasping for air, trying to process what had just happened. But rational thought was beyond me now. I could not make sense of anything I had experienced. The worst part was the growing certainty that I was not going to escape this place, not tonight. maybe not ever, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was not alone here, and whatever shared this space with me was not human, not anymore. How do you explain the unexplainable? That question haunted my thoughts as I stepped off the dusty bus, the evening air thick with humidity and the scent of approaching rain. It was a question I never imagined I would need to ask, especially not while pursuing the truth behind Alina Vance's mysterious disappearance. The celebrated author, known for her chilling tales of supernatural encounters, had vanished from her hotel room just 10 days ago. The circumstances were baffling. A simple checkout that turned into something far more sinister. The local police called it a missing person case, but I knew better. I could sense it in my bones. My name is Marcus Reed, an investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering stories others wouldn't dare touch. I had covered countless mysteries, but Alina's case felt different. It pulled at something deep within me, like a dark current drawing me toward depths I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. The past week had been consumed with research, interviewing anyone who had encountered her during her final days. The stories were consistent. A brilliant, enigmatic writer who seemed to be researching something that had consumed her entirely. But the details, the whispered rumors, those were what truly intrigued me. People spoke of strange occurrences surrounding her stay. She had been asking peculiar questions, probing into local legends, urban myths that most preferred to forget. Some claimed to have seen her talking to shadows in the hotel corridors, heard her typing frantically at all hours of the night, as if racing against time itself. I hadn't believed it initially, but as I walked through the narrow streets of Crystal Falls, something began to gnaw at my consciousness. The air felt dense, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was hiding secrets that pressed against my chest with each breath. The Valmont Hotel stood at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, its Victorian facade weathered by decades of neglect. The building was a monument to faded grandeur, its ornate stonework now cracked and stained, its windows dark as hollow eyes watching the street below. It was the kind of place you might walk past 100 times without really noticing, until something drew your attention to its quiet malevolence. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors, immediately hit by the smell of old carpet and something metallic that seemed to cling to the very walls. The lobby was dimly lit, filled with antique furniture that looked as though it hadn't been moved in years. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of ancient heating pipes and the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The desk clerk was a thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. When I mentioned Alina Vance, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something I couldn't quite identify crossing his features. "Room 247, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "3rd floor, but I must warn you, sir, that room has been difficult to maintain since the incident." I thanked him and made my way to the elevator, its brass gates creaking as they closed. The mechanism was ancient, groaning and shuddering with each floor it climbed. As we rose, I caught glimpses of the hallways through the gaps in the gate, each one seeming longer and more dimly lit than the last. The 3rd floor corridor stretched before me like a tunnel, lined with doors that all looked identical, except for their tarnished brass numbers. The carpet was worn thin in places, and the wallpaper peeled at the edges, creating patterns that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows that made the hallway feel alive. Room 247 was at the far end of the corridor, and as I approached, I felt an unmistakable chill emanating from the door itself. The brass number was slightly crooked, as if it had been disturbed recently. I stood there for a moment, listening to the profound silence that seemed to emanate from within. When I reached for the door handle, using the key the clerk had reluctantly provided, I felt it, a coldness that seemed to seep through the metal and into my bones. My hand froze just inches from the brass knob, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the empty hallway behind me. The fluorescent lights continued their erratic dance, but there was nothing there. Just shadows playing tricks on tired eyes. Yet the feeling persisted, a weight pressing against my back, as if someone was standing just close enough to breathe on my neck. Shaking off the unease, I gripped the handle and turned it. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a room that felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a mixture of old paper and something sweet that had turned sour, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The room was modest, furnished with a single bed, a writing desk, and a tall mirror that dominated the far wall. But it was the details that made my skin crawl. Papers were scattered across the desk, covered in Alina's distinctive handwriting. But the words made no sense, written in a frantic scrawl that seemed to deteriorate as it progressed across each page. Some sentences were incomplete, others repeated over and over, as if she had been trying to remember something just beyond her grasp. The mirror drew my attention like a magnet. It was an antique piece, ornate and silver-framed, but its surface was marred by a crack that ran from corner to corner in a jagged line. As I approached, I could see my reflection, but something about it felt distorted, as if the glass was showing me a version of myself that didn't quite match reality. Behind my reflection, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, shifting in the space behind where I stood. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone, but the crack seemed to have widened just slightly. I moved to the desk, careful not to disturb the papers too much. Alina's final writings were a maze of fragmented thoughts and observations about the hotel, about voices she claimed to hear in the walls, about something she called the Watchers. Her handwriting became increasingly erratic as the pages progressed, until the final sheets were nearly illegible, filled with repeated phrases about mirrors and doorways and things that shouldn't exist. One passage, written in shaking letters, caught my attention. They're not reflections, they're windows, and something is trying to come through. A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. The room felt colder suddenly, and I could have sworn I heard something, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I looked up from the papers, and that's when I saw her. In the mirror, standing directly behind me, was a figure draped in shadows. Not the woman in black from some Gothic novel, but something far more disturbing. It was as if darkness itself had taken form, with eyes that burned like embers in the void of its face. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, but I could feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, silent except for the soft hum of the heating system. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, but the crack in the glass had definitely grown larger. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but before I could dial, I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside. But these weren't ordinary footsteps. They had a quality that seemed to echo from somewhere far deeper than the carpeted floor, as if they were coming from beneath the building itself, or from some place that existed parallel to our reality. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The footsteps continued, growing closer, accompanied now by a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My rational mind told me it was probably just another guest. But every instinct I had screamed that whatever was in that hallway was not human. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, deliberately, the door handle began to turn. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the moving handle. The door opened with agonizing slowness, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. But standing in the doorway was nothing I could have prepared for. It was tall, impossibly tall, and seemed to be made of shadow and mist. Its form shifted and wavered, as if it couldn't quite decide what shape it wanted to hold. Where its face should have been, there were only 2 points of red light, burning like coals in the darkness. "Marcus, read," it said, and its voice was like wind through dry leaves, like whispers in an empty house. "You should not have come here." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The thing filled the doorway, and I could feel its presence pressing against my mind like a physical weight. The air in the room grew thick, making it difficult to breathe. Alina Vance thought she could understand us. It continued, its voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She thought she could write about us, make us into characters in her stories. But we are not fiction, Marcus Reed. We are the spaces between reality, the shadows that exist in the corners of your vision. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What did you do to her? The red lights that served as its eyes flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw something that might have been amusement. We showed her the truth, the same truth we will show you. The room around me began to shift and change. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like living tissue. The mirror's cracks spread across its surface like a spider web, and through the gaps, I could see not my reflection, but glimpses of somewhere else entirely. A place of endless corridors and doors that led to nowhere, where the laws of physics seemed to bend and twist according to some alien logic. This hotel, the shadow continued, is a thin place, a place where the barriers between worlds grow weak. Alina discovered this, and it fascinated her. She thought she could study us, document us, turn us into entertainment for her readers. But we do not wish to be studied, Marcus Reed. We wish to be left alone. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. The shadow stepped into the room, and as it did, the temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath misting in the air. The papers on the desk began to flutter and dance, as if caught in a wind that I couldn't feel. You came looking for answers, it said, moving closer. We will give you answers, but first, you must understand that some truths are too dangerous for your world. Some knowledge is meant to remain hidden. The shadow reached out with what might have been a hand, and I felt a coldness that went deeper than my skin, deeper than my bones. It touched something essential within me, and in that moment, I understood with terrifying clarity that I was no longer just an observer of this mystery. I had become part of it. The world around me dissolved into darkness. When consciousness returned, I found myself standing in a place that defied description. The ground beneath my feet was solid, but it seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. The sky above was not sky at all, but a swirling mass of shadows and half-formed shapes that moved with purpose I couldn't fathom. Structures rose around me, buildings that followed no earthly architecture. They twisted and curved in impossible ways, their surfaces covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. The air was filled with whispers in languages I had never heard, yet somehow understood on a level that bypassed conscious thought. And everywhere there were the watchers, shadows like the one I had encountered in the hotel room, but different, each one unique in its own disturbing way. They moved through this realm like fish through water, their red eyes tracking my every movement. "Welcome to the space between spaces," a voice said behind me. I turned to find Alina Vance standing there, but she was not as I remembered her from photographs. Her skin was pale as moonlight. Her eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever. And when she smiled, it was with knowledge of things that should not be known. "Alina," I whispered, hardly believing what I was seeing. "You're alive." She laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in this place. Alive is such a limited concept, Marcus. I am more than alive. I am aware. I have seen behind the curtain of reality, and I can never go back. "I came to find you," I said, though the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. "People are worried about you. They think you've disappeared." "I have not disappeared," she replied, walking closer. "I have simply stepped through the mirror, so to speak. This realm has always existed alongside yours, Marcus. We simply lacked the eyes to see it." The watchers moved closer, forming a circle around us. Their presence was overwhelming, a constant pressure against my consciousness that made it difficult to think clearly. I could feel them probing at my mind, exploring my memories, my fears, my deepest secrets. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, struggling to maintain my sanity in the face of such impossible revelations. Alina's expression grew serious. "Because you came looking for the truth, and the truth is that your world and ours are not as separate as you might believe. The barriers are weakening, Marcus. Soon, the watchers will not need places like the Valmont Hotel to interact with your reality. They will be able to walk openly in your world." "That's impossible," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't. The evidence was all around me. The shadow creatures, this impossible realm, Alina herself, changed by her exposure to forces beyond human understanding. "Nothing is impossible," Alina replied. "Only improbable, and even improbability becomes certainty given enough time." She gestured to the twisted structures around us. "This is what lies beneath the surface of your reality, Marcus. This is what Alina Vance discovered when she came to Crystal Falls to research local legends. She found that the legends were true, and more than that, she found that they were only the beginning." The watchers pressed closer, and I could feel their alien thoughts brushing against my mind like ice-cold fingers. They were ancient, older than human civilization, older than the earth itself. They had watched the universe unfold from the shadows, patient observers of the cosmic dance between order and chaos. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "We want you to understand," the shadow that had first appeared to me said, its voice echoing from everywhere at once. "We want you to carry the truth back to your world, not to share it, for that would cause chaos and madness, but to bear witness to it. To know that you are not alone in the universe, that there are forces beyond your comprehension, watching from the spaces between spaces. And if I refuse," Alina's smile was sad and knowing, "then you will join us here, permanently. You will become one of the Watchers, forever caught between worlds, forever aware of the truth that drives lesser minds to madness." The choice was not really a choice at all. Return to my world carrying the burden of impossible knowledge, or lose myself entirely in this realm of shadows and whispers. I thought of my life, my career, the simple certainties that had governed my existence until this moment. All of it seemed so small now, so insignificant compared to the vast truths that surrounded me. "I'll return," I said, and as I spoke the words, I felt something fundamental shift within me. The Watchers approved, their red eyes flickering with what might have been satisfaction. "Then remember this," Alina said, moving close enough that I could feel the impossible coldness that emanated from her transformed form. "Remember that reality is far more fragile than you ever imagined. Remember that there are things in the darkness that watch and wait, and that the barriers between worlds are not as strong as they once were." She reached out and touched my forehead, and in that instant I was back in room 247, standing before the cracked mirror. But everything had changed. The room felt different, charged with energies that made my skin tingle. The papers on the desk were gone, as if they had never existed. The mirror's crack had spread across its entire surface, creating a web of fractured glass that reflected not my image, but glimpses of that other realm. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the room. But as I reached for the handle, I heard Alina's voice one last time, not from the shadow realm, but from the mirror itself. "Tell them nothing, Marcus. Let them wonder. Let them create their own explanations for my disappearance. But know that I am not gone. I am simply somewhere else, watching, waiting, learning truths that would shatter the minds of ordinary people." I fled the hotel, running through the lobby past the hollow-eyed clerk, bursting through the heavy doors into the humid night air. But even as I stood on the street, breathing heavily and trying to convince myself that what I had experienced was some kind of hallucination, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The Watchers had marked me. I could feel their presence at the edges of my consciousness, a constant reminder that I was being observed by forces beyond human understanding. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every reflection held the potential for something else to look back at me. In the days that followed, I tried to write Alina's story, to make sense of what had happened to her and to me. But the words wouldn't come. How could I explain the unexplainable? How could I describe experiences that existed outside the boundaries of human language? I filed my report with the Crystal Falls police, stating that I had found no evidence of foul play in Alina Vance's disappearance. The case was quietly closed, filed away with dozens of other unsolved mysteries that the authorities preferred not to think about too deeply. But late at night, when the world grew quiet and the shadows seemed to move with purpose of their own, I would remember Alina's words about the barriers between worlds growing weak. I would think about the Watchers and their patient observation of human affairs. and I would wonder if perhaps the greatest story of my career was one that I could never tell, a truth too dangerous for the world to know. The mirror in my apartment began to show strange reflections. Not always, but often enough that I stopped looking at it directly. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement in its surface, shadows that belonged to no earthly source. And sometimes, late at night when sleep eluded me, I would hear whispers in the walls, voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. Alina Vance had disappeared, but she had not vanished. She had simply stepped through the looking glass into a reality that existed parallel to our own. And in doing so, she had opened a door that could never be completely closed. I carry the truth now, the knowledge that we are not alone, that there are watchers in the shadows who have observed the universe since before time began. It is a burden I cannot share, a secret that would drive others to madness if they truly understood its implications. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I find myself wondering if perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the truth is meant to be known only by those who can bear its weight, those who can live with the knowledge that reality is far stranger and more fragile than anyone imagines. The watchers continue their eternal vigil, and I continue mine. We are bound together now, observer and observed, human and shadow, forever connected by the terrible truth that lies hidden in the spaces between spaces. And in the Valmont Hotel, room 247 remains empty, its cracked mirror waiting for the next seeker of truth who might be brave enough, or foolish enough, to look beyond the boundaries of the known world. The whispers never stop. They are always there at the edge of hearing, reminding me that I am not alone, that I am watched, that I am part of something far larger and more complex than I ever imagined possible. How do you explain the unexplainable? You don't. You simply learn to live with it, to carry the weight of impossible knowledge, and to hope that the barriers between worlds remain strong enough to keep the watchers in their realm and humanity in ours. But deep down, in the quiet places of my soul, I know that hope may be all we have left. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.